Chapter 2. I didn't want to be there, it was going to be nasty, and I just didn't want to do it. Since Terry was out of town with Bill this morning, and Devin needed the rest of the Anakitos team, there was no one left to stay with me. We still had no idea where West and Troy were, and I couldn't blame Devin for wanting me to keep an enforcer with me at all times. I sat in the cab of the truck. It was my choice. I could have gotten out and watched what they were doing, but I would have had to keep my distance from Mickey and Gavin, as they were guarding Brandon and I didn't want to be anywhere near him. I still hadn't spoken to him since his return. I'd only seen him that once, last week. I didn't know if I would ever be able to. I could have gone to talk to Gabriel. Devin's protective reactions towards him had dramatically eased since we'd sealed our mating, but Gabriel was standing next to the mine, lowering Caden down the shaft. While I didn't know exactly what they would be bringing up from the shaft, I'd gotten close while they'd set up a tripod over the hole, and the smell was bad enough. I didn't want to know more. I'd gotten back in the truck and was doing my best to distract myself with a book on my personal communications device, or PCD. "Shit," Devin's voice came from where he stood near the rear of the truck. "What?" I asked, unable to stop myself from twisting around to look at him. "Caden says there's water in the bottom. This just got a lot more difficult." I looked at him a moment longer, then shrugged and turned back to my book. I knew they had to pull Bryson Jessup's body out of the hole and dispose of it so it couldn't be found and traced back to us. It was part of keeping the kitsune a secret. If regular humans somehow found out that shapeshifters exist and live among them, all hell would break loose. As the Pax Theron, a big part of keeping that secret fell to Devin, more so since Brandon had killed Jessup for murdering Annie as a threat me. Not that Brandon hadn't been a threat to me, but apparently that didn't figure into his thinking. After learning about Annie's death, Brandon tried to find out who had done it in order to keep them from doing the same to me, or so he claimed. I had no reason to doubt him, but I had none to believe him either. Devin, Bill, and the enforcer team had been trying to solve the murder too, but Brandon had inside information. He knew who was part of the supremacist group he'd been a member of, and that he'd recruited from in his quest to make me his. At the time, he'd refused to believe I didn't feel the same mating instinct for him that he felt for me, and he'd done everything he could to make me his. But the tenuous link he'd felt had been broken when Devin and I sealed our mating. Brandon had lost his clawing need to possess me, but that didn't stop the rest of them. He had started it months earlier with simple harassment, creepy notes/tires, but it had escalated and he'd been banned. Then he had had me kidnapped, and other members of his group had murdered another kitsune girl and left a copy of the news article about her death under my door, with another threat scrawled across it. That's where he'd come to his senses. He'd told us that once he found out about Annie's death, he left the ones who were with him in Texas and come home. He'd used his knowledge of the group he'd once been a part of to figure out who had killed Annie and make them pay. He'd learned there were 3 men responsible. The first of those had been Jessup. When Devin had questioned him further, Brandon admitted to convincing Jessup to go for a run together. While they were out in the middle of nowhere, he'd attacked. First with fists, then finally shifting and killing the other man while in wolf form. He'd left a body with evidence of a fist fight and an animal attack. A good medical examiner would likely be able to tell they'd both happened at about the same time, raising suspicion, and leaving law enforcement looking for a murderer, and maybe something more. Bag him and bring him up, we'll worry about getting rid of any extra water later. Devin called to Caden where he still hung down the mine shaft that was several feet beyond the tailgate of the truck. "We're gonna have to find a way to dry him out some before we can burn the body," he muttered. "Unless I can come up with another way to make it cease to exist." Over the next hour, I did my best to not hear what was going on a scant few feet away. I didn't want to think about what they were doing, much less see it. Finally, after what seemed like hours, though I knew it hadn't been all that long, Devin came around to the driver's side and climbed in behind the wheel. Gavin opened the passenger's side door and slid in on my other side. "All done?" I asked. "We're finished here." Devin turned the key in the ignition of the pickup that was nearly as old as I was. The engine roared to life and purred smoothly. Devin's dad, Sean, had kept the truck in top condition while Devin had been gone, but it hadn't been driven much in the 10 years Devin was in the army. Now that he was home, Devin seemed happy to have the truck back. It might be old, but my husband treated it as if it were new. Here. I frowned and looked at him, then turned to look at Gavin, not knowing who would tell me what he meant. We've collected what's left of the body and done what we can to eliminate any trace that he was here, but we still have to deal with the remains. Gavin gripped the handle over the door beside him and held on, bracing himself for the bumps and bouncing of the rough road between the mine and the paved highway. How are we going to do that? I only looked at Gavin a moment before turning back to Devin. He focused his attention on the road as he eased the pickup over deep holes and sharp rocks. He glanced at me for just a moment before turning his eyes back to the rough track of a road. I have an idea. Gray clouds loomed low and threatening as we pulled in the driveway at home. Gavin's truck was parked in the yard where we'd left it that morning. Devin pulled in beside the other pickup and killed the engine. Instead of getting out, he sat beside me a moment. He seemed to be waiting for something. Still feeling a little off from the idea of what we'd done that morning, I sat beside him, staring at my lap. Devin wrapped an arm around my shoulders and pulled me against him. Without a word, Gavin opened the passenger door and slipped out of the truck, leaving us alone. You okay, baby? My husband murmured against my neck. He'd been asking me that a lot lately. I think so, I said. I just never thought I'd be on this side of the law. My voice was dull, flat. I knew it, but I didn't have the energy or will to put more life into it. You mean hiding things from the police, from Rain? Rain is my brother. He's a police officer with the Safford Thatcher Police Department, and he'd been a lot of help to us. He and my parents were the only ones in my family who knew about the kitsune. I didn't like hiding things from them, but some things you don't get a choice in. I nodded. Beside me, Devin sighed and hugged me tighter against him. When you're ready to talk, I'm here. He placed a soft kiss on the top of my head and opened the truck door. Without the heater running, we're losing heat fast, come on. He helped me out of the truck, making sure I didn't slip on the icy gravel, and stayed beside me as we went inside. Shrugging out of his coat, he hung it in the closet behind the front door. It's a good thing we made it in before the storm. He took my coat and hung it up too. I don't like being on the roads when it's snowing. Too many idiots out there who don't know they haven't the faintest clue how to drive in it. Me too. I collapsed onto one sofa and stared across the room at the fireplace. Noticing that someone had readied a fire without lighting it, I frowned. What's wrong? Devin asked, bending down in front of me. I glanced at him, then looked back to the fireplace. Did you do that? He turned. No, it was still warm when I checked it this morning. I sat there frowning at the fireplace for a moment. I was aware that Devin had walked away, but I was more concerned with who had messed with the fireplace to wonder where he was going. A few minutes later he reappeared, a pair of steaming mugs in his hands. Gavin did it when he got here, before we left. Devin sat beside me on the sofa and handed me one of the mugs. Taking the cup, I sipped the cocoa and sighed and relaxed as the warmth spread through me, then scowled. Why didn't I think of Gavin? Because you're tired and stressed. Devin took a long drink from his own mug. You might not want to admit it, even to yourself, but you can't hide it from me. Not when we're so closely linked. He leaned over and kissed the top of my head. My heart melted. I knew the last few weeks had been hard, not just for me but for him too. He might not have felt the physical pain the way I had, but it had been his baby too, and the loss of our child had hurt us both. There had been more than a few days where I hadn't wanted to get out of bed or see anyone, much less deal with the regular stream of people needing Devin's direction or input. He had dealt with it all, and without a single complaint. He'd been a rock, taking care of not just me but everyone who came in looking for his opinion or help. As the pack's Theron, it was Devon's responsibility to oversee all the security for the pack. It also meant he was in charge of any investigations the Anakitos needed, as well as meting out any punishments that the Anakitos or Electo ordered. His duties had sometimes pulled him away when I knew he would have rather stayed with me. Through the constant mental connection of our mating, I'd felt his conflict when that happened, and I'd tried to assure him it was okay. I understood he didn't want to go. I wasn't sure it had made him feel any better. One thing he'd done that I hadn't realized until I'd had to do it was keep me from having to see Brandon. It had been harder than I'd thought it would be. The anger that had surged through me when I first saw him had been nearly blinding. I'd wanted to scream, cry, and claw at him with nails. I hadn't realized how much I blamed him for my miscarriage until I'd seen his bruised and battered face. On the way out to the old mine and home again, I'd had little to do but think about it. I'd noticed once we'd gotten there that Brandon again had fresh and fading bruises. I wondered if Devon had done it or ordered it. I took another drink of my chocolate and picked up Devon's hand from where it lay on his leg. Weaving my fingers between his, I pulled it against my chest and looked at his knuckles. There was no sign of damage, no bruising or torn skin, but if he'd injured his knuckles doing it, as long as they were his only injuries, it would have healed within a day or even a few hours. With a sigh, I let our joined hands fall to my lap. "What's wrong?" he asked again, his voice gentle. I was quiet for a few seconds, thinking about how to approach the subject. "Are you the one who did that to Brandon?" I looked at him, watching his reaction. "Not this time, no." His response was slow, his face open and honest. "This time?" He closed his eyes for a moment, then said, "This time." "How many times has he been beaten like this?" He shrugged. "I haven't kept track, but he spent most of the time since he turned up looking like he did today." I looked at him a moment. "That's been more than 2 months. Are you telling me he's been beaten every few days for that entire time?" Devon looked away. "Pretty much." I thought about that for a moment. The idea didn't bother me as much as it probably should have. When I first saw him, I'd wanted to shred him to pieces for what he'd done to me. How could I blame the men in my life, the ones who cared for me, and had taken care of me after I'd broken both arms, and after I had to kill someone to escape the kidnappers Brandon had sent after me? How could I blame the people who'd been with me day in and day out for months because we didn't know who was out there and when they might try to hurt me again, for feeling the same way? Hell, I knew he'd been beaten repeatedly and I still wanted to hurt him myself. I figured with the number of pack members who would want retribution, Brandon was lucky to be alive. "Is it safe to assume he's worn your bruises a time or two?" I dropped my head to rest against his shoulder. "More than just a couple times." I sat a moment longer before speaking again. "I'm okay with that." I felt his surprise through our connection that had sparked when we'd sealed our mating and had grown stronger since. I rarely got fully formed thoughts through the connection. Instead, I often got echoes of his emotions. It wasn't usually so obvious, but once in a while they came through loud and clear. "You sure?" He lifted the arm behind my head, turned sideways on the seat, pulled me into his lap and settled his arms around my middle. "I am." I drained the last of the cocoa from my mug and let it rest on my leg. We sat that way for several minutes before Gavin appeared in the arched doorway that led to the hall and the rest of the house. "Your dinner is in the oven and the timer's set. Do you need me to hang around here, sir, or do you have something else for me to do?" "You don't have to cook for us, Gavin," I said. "It's not part of your job, I can cook." I looked at him but didn't move from where I half lay, leaning against Devon. "I know, Nikki, but you had a difficult day. I was afraid you wouldn't want to eat. But I know that if I take the time to make you something, you'll eat it." He shot a sly smile in my direction before turning his attention back to Devon. Gavin was right. The manners my mother had drilled into me wouldn't let me not eat if someone had gone to the trouble of cooking for me. Thank you. I laid my head against Devon's shoulder. Like I told you when we left the mine, that's all for today, Devon said. I closed my eyes and enjoyed the deep timbre of Devon's voice vibrating through my body. Though I'm not surprised you didn't head home as soon as we pulled in. He paused for a second, then continued, if anything else comes up, I'll call, but I think we're going to spend the afternoon right here. It's cold and wet, and right now I couldn't think of anything important enough to drag us out in it. I'll see you in the morning then? Sounds good, Devon said. I looked at Gavin in time to see him nod and turn back to the kitchen. A couple of minutes later, I heard the soft click of the latch on the back door, then an engine started, and the sound soon faded away as he pulled out of the yard. What do you want to do tonight? Devon said, his cheek pressed to the top of my head. Nothing. I relaxed against him, reveling in his familiar smoky scent while absorbing the warmth from his arms still wrapped around me. He leaned to one side and set his empty mug on the coffee table, took mine and set it beside his, then leaned back and wrapped both arms around me once more. Talk to me, baby. Just tired. My voice was flat. It had been that way a lot lately, and even I was getting tired of it, but I didn't know how to pull myself out of the funk I'd settled in. How about I light that fire over there, then we pick a couple of films and spend the evening curled together, pretending we're the only two people in the whole world. I lifted my head to look at him a moment. That sounds heavenly.